Don't let the smart speaker be the only frequency.
Your protection from deception. This is Truth Frequency Radio.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the We Heart America show with Donna and Ella. Each week, we take you on a compelling and thrilling journey featuring American legends, unsung heroes, and esteemed celebrities every Monday at 3 p.m. Eastern and noon Pacific Standard Time. Myself and my fellow co-host, best-selling author Donald Jeffries, will showcase incredible stories from fascinating people. Get the inside scoop from the most intriguing people in the world. And now I'm going to turn it over to my co-host, Donald Jeffries, who will introduce today's guest.
Thanks, Ella. Jude Kessler is a fascinating. Has written a fascinating series on John Lennon, the only historical narrative on the life of John Lennon. Very detailed, in-depth series of books. She's pretty much the foremost. It seems to me the pretty much foremost expert on John Lennon in the world. So, Jude, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Don and Ella. Thank you very, very much. My favorite topic was better way to spend a day than talking about John Lennon.
Go ahead, Don.
Yeah, I was just going to say the obvious first question is how did you, I mean, so many of us love the Beatles. I mean, I was, I think 7 when they came out of nowhere. I was already a Beatles fan then. I loved them, and obviously older people, teenagers and so forth, loved them. How did you get to the point where you decided to make this your life's work? And especially the one particular, I mean, Lennon is my favorite Beatle, so I can understand it. But what made you gravitate to decide you're going to write this extremely detailed and intense series of books on John Lennon?
Well, I was a pretty studious kid. I graduated from high school a year early and went on to college at Northwestern State University in Louisiana to get 2 degrees in 3 years, one in history and one in English. And I did a minor in research and went on straight from there to do my master's work at University of Maryland. And I knew that what I wanted to do in my life was write a book about someone that told their story as a narrative or a novel, but that every sentence just about was footnoted and documented so that people were getting the actual story. But I didn't know who that person was going to be. I was a very devoted John Lennon fan from the time that I was 9, so I'm 2 years older than you are, Don, when they hit America. In fact, in December of 1963, which would predate the Ed Sullivan appearance, some of my friends came up to me at elementary school in Alexandria, Louisiana, and said, look, these are the Beatles. We know, you're not following them, but they're the hottest thing. You have to pick one to fall in love with by recess. I was like, what? By recess? And I ended up picking George Harrison, but I could see that really upset them. I could see that's not what they expected. So I went home that night and called their big sisters and asked about the Beatles and found out what was going on. And the next day announced that it was going to be the leader Beatle, the smart Beatle, John Lennon. But when I graduated from college and graduate school and decided it was time to start gathering research on this thing that I wanted to do, I thought, well, the only person that I'm really an authority on is John Lennon. So John's story has everything anyone would love: sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And that would be a hit book. Well, honestly, and you guys know what I'm getting ready to say, I knew zero about John Lennon. I knew, only the myth and not the facts. I did not know his life story, that he had been abandoned as a child and that he connected with his mom only in time to watch her die a violent death. And, his life was filled with one tragedy after another, the kind of tragedies that would stop us dead in our tracks, that would make us bitter and cynical and would make most people give up. And I began to develop a huge admiration for him, not as an artist, not as a writer, not as a peace activist, not even as a Beatle, but as a person who had been kicked by life repeatedly and who never, ever gave up. And so it has been my honor for the last 34 years to research and tell his life story. And I'm only halfway through. I am up to book 5 right now. It's going to be a 9-volume series, but I'm in 1965, 66. And of course, that's the sad part of the story, where the Beatles are now they've reached the apex. They've reached the top in 64, and now things are going to begin to fall apart. So, I've written all the happy years, and now I'm getting ready to write the more tragic years. But it has been my honor to tell the story of this man who never let anything defeat him.
And look at John Lennon. Out of all that chaos, he was able to create beautiful music. So I do see a pattern with musicians. Some of the most successful musicians are still broken people even after their success, but he had all that tragedy and experience to draw upon.
He did, Ella. And the thing is this, if you go back and look at the poets, if you look at Keats and Shelley and Wordsworth during the Romantic era, if you go over to America and you look at all of the writers that were living in Concord, even Louisa May Alcott with her struggle during the Civil War with getting fever and having all of her hair fall out and having to reinvent herself, and growing up with Bronson Alcott, who was a very demanding father, all the people that were living there, Thoreau and Emerson and Hawthorne. What do they all have in common? What do the great artists have in common? Adversity. They live lives of pain, and somehow they have the personality that allows them to do what that legendary Rumpelstiltskin did in the storybooks. They take the straw that is their lives and they weave it somehow magically into gold. And that's what John did. I mean, even Paul, we think of Paul as the happy Beatle, but Paul's mother died when he's only 14 years old of breast cancer. And so these two young men who lost their mothers in their teen years are able to take this tremendous loss and this pain and somehow weave it into beauty.
Mm-hmm. And I think Ringo Starr is about the only one who had somewhat of a nurturing childhood. My question, though, is also what reasons do you think, in your expertise, in your expert opinion, did they skyrocket to the top of the music charts and become such an iconic band?
Well, and I think you just touched on it right there, because Ringo, even though his mother and his stepfather are very, very supportive, Ringo's appendix burst when he was a little boy. And they put him in the hospital. They thought he was going to die. And he ended up staying there for years. And his mother wasn't allowed to visit him. They just would not let parents come into the hospital. She got to come in once at night when he was asleep to check on him, because they thought it would make it too hard for the children that were there on long-term stay to have their parents pop in and out. So the minute he gets out of hospital, then he gets pleurisy and has to go back in for years again. He doesn't get to go to school. He doesn't get to grow up in a home. He grows up in a sanitarium. And even with George, and George had the most stable family by far, but George had lived a life of poverty and did not have very much. In fact, was making his own guitar, building his own guitar. And I think that shaped the Beatles. They were the hardest working, most determined group of young men ever. If you look at, let's just take, there are so many instances. Well, we could go back to Hamburg when they're living in an 8x8 concrete room with no windows. And for 3.5, 4 months, they're bathing in the latrine of a nasty theater called the Bambi Kino, where there's no shower, there's only a sink and a broken mirror, and the sink only has cold water, and that's where they bathed for 3.5 months. So, in that even they had determination. But if you fast forward to the spring of 1964, they're getting up at 5:30 in the morning because they have to be in hair and makeup on set in London by 7 o'clock, 6:45, 7 o'clock. They make A Hard Day's Night from 8 until 5 or 5:30, sometimes 6. And at lunch, they record their interviews and radio shows. Then in the evening, they go and do public appearances and record television shows. They get home about 10 o'clock at night. And when John gets home to Emperor's Gate, where he's living, there is a man named Tom Mashler, who works for Jonathan Cape Publishers. They are waiting for him because John is releasing his first book. And as an author, just releasing a book is stress enough. But he works with Tom Mashler from 10 o'clock until after midnight, editing the book and doing the illustrations for the book because it's coming out soon. Goes to bed about 1 and is up by 5:30 and does it all again. And this goes on for months and months and months and months. They were so determined because of their childhoods, and they were so hardworking. Other bands truly were gifted and talented and had so much going for them, but no one outworked the Beatles.
I heard that they, and I may be wrong, they basically recorded most of the album in one day.
Their first one, yes. In February, they got together. They started at 10 o'clock in the morning. John was sick. He was running fever about 103. All of them were sick. They had flu. It was the winter of 1962-63 was the coldest winter on record in England and still is the coldest winter. And they'd been on a tour bus with little Helen Shapiro, who had had a hit in her teens. And they were going from dank cold theater to dank cold theater. And as we know now from COVID, many of these viruses survive much better in cold weather. And they were probably touching door handles and all kinds of things in the theaters. And so they were very, very sick. And they get there, they set up, they start after a little bit after 10. And then they record all day long. And at 10 o'clock that night, I mean, we laugh when we think about today when artists go in to make an LP, they are in studio for months, sometimes even years. They have one day because they've got to go back to that tour bus. And at 10 o'clock at night, they don't have a closer for the album. And so they take a break. They go to the canteen at EMI or Parlophone, whatever you want to call it, the recording studio on 3 Abbey Road. And they sit down with the producer, George Martin, and he says, what do you have from your stage show that we could use for the closer? What's your pot boiler? And Paul says, well, you know, John's got Twist and Shout. And they all glance at John because he's really sick in his throat. He's been singing since 10 in the morning. And Twist and Shout, as you guys know from listening to it, is a rip your throat. I mean, John could frequently feel his throat bleeding when he sang it. And they looked at him and he said, I can do it the once. And so they go back, they begin to turn the lights on in the studio. They're those kind of lights like you'd have in a gymnasium that takes a while to warm up. And when he steps up to the microphone, it's still dark in the studio, a little bit like the Cavern Club where he used to sing. He steps up to that mic, he lets loose with Shake It Up, Baby, Twist and Shout. And in one take, he perfects this song that closes Please, Please Me. And they can finally call it a day. And they've got their first LP. What a day.
Absolutely. Well, you know, I think there's so many things about the Eagles that were groundbreaking, but other than, I think they were inspired a lot by Buddy Holly and the Crickets. And of course, the legend is that, you know, that John Lennon named the Beatles because of his admiration for the Crickets and Buddy Holly and the Crickets. But Buddy Holly was one of the first performers to write all his own music, and he didn't quite have the Beatles image, but when the Beatles came, they were the first group that I know of that wrote all their own material, and they also set the standard for the 60s and into the 70s of the, you know, the typical lineup of the, you know, the bass, lead, and rhythm guitar and the drum set with the name on it. I mean, they were the first to do that, weren't they?
Absolutely. And Buddy Holly, without a doubt, was their driving influence. I mean, John Lennon said, for Elvis, there was nothing. And he did. He combed his hair like Elvis. There is a portrait of him on the cover of my first book, Should Have Been There, that was done by the famous Beatles artist Shannon. And he has his hair just exactly like Elvis. And when Chaz Newby, the Beatles' first bass player, saw the cover, he grabbed it and said, now that's the John Lennon I know, you know, with the Elvis do. So Elvis was a huge influence, but Buddy Holly came to Liverpool and played the Liverpool Philharmonic when John was in his teens, and none of the Beatles could afford to go. None of them went. And I'm sure Julia, John's mother, who loved rock and roll and really introduced him to rock and roll, so wanted to take her son to hear Buddy Holly at the Philharmonic, but they couldn't afford it. But because Buddy Holly sang there, he was the pervasive influence on Liverpool. And so many of these bands had a country and Western bent. They loved country and Western music, and they loved the Texas part about Buddy Holly, that background that he had. And so he inspired them, and they even covered Buddy Holly at one point. But yes, you're right. They saw themselves not just as entertainers and performers, but as composers. And they've been writing songs. Paul and John have been writing songs together in a little spiral notebook all through their teen years. The one after 909 is one of the ones that they had written very early on. And in spite of all the danger, which is on the quote unquote B-side of their first recording, which they recorded at a little studio in the summer of 1958. And they've been writing all along. So when they go in to record their first record, George Martin, their producer at EMI, tells them that they are going to do a Tin Pan Alley song that he selected for them. That's what you did. If you were a group, you always recorded a song that was sure to be a hit, a song written by professional musicians that was guaranteed to make money. And Paul and John look at each other and look at him and say, no, we're not going to do that. We can't record. It was How Do You Do It? And I know you know that song. It's kind of bubblegummy and peppy and bright and all that. And if we record that song, we can't go back to Liverpool. People will laugh us off the streets. I mean, we're tough. We can't record that song. And he said, well, what did you have in mind? And they, well, we've written our own song, Love Me Do. I mean, this would be like me going to the Smithsonian and saying, I want you to exhibit one of my paintings. He was blown away. How rude and impetuous that you would suggest that you scruffs from Liverpool think you have a better song than a Tin Pan Alley surefire hit. But they went to lunch at the Alpino restaurant, sat down and had plates of spaghetti and meatballs and talked him into it. And so he said, you know what, let me tweak it. Let me make some suggestions. And the one suggestion that he put his foot down about is that this was John's song and John sang it. And he also played the mouth organ in the song so that the song was going to sound like love, love me. And he played the mouth organ. And he said, John, you can't sing the song. People are going to make fun of it. They're going to call it Love Me Wah. Love Me Wah, because you don't say the do, you play the mouth organ at that point. Paul has to sing the song. And Paul didn't want to sing it. It wasn't in his vocal range. It was too high. He did not want the song. But they went back, they retooled, they worked on it, and they released Love Me Do. And thank goodness they put their foot down or their feet down, you know. Because
I'm really learning something. I know a lot about the Beatles. I thought for sure that was one of Paul's songs. I had no idea. This is a fantastic story. I didn't know this was John's song and that Paul sang it because of that. That's wonderful. I don't know how I've never heard that before.
Yeah, and John was so resentful because, of course, it goes to number 17, and he's so furious that Paul gets to net the first hit. They were highly competitive, that he's determined he's going to supersede him. He's going to write a number one, and he does, Please Please Me. But, you know, I mean, it was John's song. It was taken right out of his hands.
Wow.
Go ahead.
Go ahead, Ellen. You got something?
Yeah, I was just hoping that we'd have a little time to focus on some of the songs, like some of the more popular songs and where their inspirations came from, because I was reading about some of the songs, and one of my all-time favorite songs is Lucy in the Sky. I can remember that since I was a child. I had a teacher, she was kind of a hippie, and she would play that. And do you know the background on that song?
I do. In fact, the lady that inspired it, you know, we think of the Beatles as still being in their 20s. You know, you think of them and these images pop up of either the John in his granny glasses in the late 20s or the early wearing the Pierre Cardin fitted pocketless suits. But the lady that inspired it, the little girl that inspired it, just died about a year ago. A girl in Julian Lennon's, John's first son, with his wife Cynthia, in Julian's class at school, had done a drawing of a little girl called Lucy in the sky with diamonds. And so Julian brought it home and showed it to his dad, and that was the inspiration for the song. Now, everybody said, "Oh, this song is about LSD."
Yes.
I heard that, but we know better. It was innocent. It was an innocent approach.
Because John had no problem admitting when he was singing about LSD. He wasn't embarrassed. He loved LSD. He tried it against his will in 1965. In late March of 1965, his dentist had given it to George and John and Cynthia and Patty Boyd in an after-dinner cup of coffee without asking their permission, something they were incensed about, because you don't drug someone without asking their permission. And that night they were driving. They had to get all the way back out to the stockbroker belt in their car. It was lucky, really lucky they weren't killed. But John felt like for him, vistas were open that night. And he immediately began to try to force Cynthia to take it all the time. And she did not want to. When she was a mother, she did not like the feeling of being out of it. And she had bad experiences, and was really, I would say, the number one contributing factor to them ending up divorcing finally. But he had no problem with saying that he took LSD and that he found it a good thing. So if the song had actually been about LSD, he would have had no problem saying that's what it was about. It was a very otherworldly dream vision, Peter Max, late 1960s surrealistic world that was being created and inspired by this little girl's drawing. And that's what it was.
Well, how about like Strawberry Field? We certainly heard that. I mean, that's one of my favorites. And that's was that is it Lennon? Did he just, because it was near them, the Strawberry Fields orphanage, or how did he come to write that?
Yeah, Mimi, his aunt who raised him, he grew up when he was about 4.5, 5 years old. His father came home from World War II and found that John had been living more and more with his aunt and uncle. His mother was living with a man named John Dykins that she dearly loved. And she had asked Fred Lennon for a divorce, and Fred had refused her. And so she moved in with this man anyway. And you can imagine how shocking that was in the 1950s. I mean, you did not do that in the 1950s. And John just felt like a third wheel in this new romantic relationship. And so he would get on the bus with green seats, and that would take him to his aunt and uncle's house. And they had a radio that he loved listening to. They had fixed him a little room above the glassed-in porch, and he could go up there and draw. And he hung little paper skeletons all over the ceiling. He had strings he could pull and make them dance. And so more and more, he was staying with his aunt and uncle. And when his father found him living there and not with his wife, Julia, he didn't ask anyone's permission. He took the little boy and they went away to the seaside, and he was booking passage, or he had booked passage for his friend Billy Hall, for John, and for himself to go to New Zealand, where he was going to take part in the black market nylon trade, selling nylons, black market, and make money. And he was going to raise his son. Well, the night before he's to set sail with John and Billy Hall, Julia finds them. Actually, Fred's brother sold him out and told Julia where he was. And he said, if you want to see your son again, you better go tonight, because they're leaving tomorrow. And John said for years and years and years and years that they put him in between the two of them and made him decide, do you want your dad or do you want me? And this 4.5-year-old boy chooses his father, because he's been with him for 3 weeks. And when he sees his mother walking away crying, he runs after her and screaming, "Mommy, don't go," which later will come out in his music. And she picks him up, takes him back to Liverpool, deposits him with her sister, and goes off and lives her own life. So he's growing up with his Aunt Mimi and his wonderful, sweet, kind, loving Uncle George. The man's name was George Too Good Smith, and he was exactly that. He was too good. He was sweet, and John adored him. And every summer, Mimi would take him to this reception that Strawberry Fields would have, or Strawberry Field singular would have. It was a beautiful Tudor mansion orphanage. And he would go there. I think it was probably to get public endorsement and get people to donate money to the orphanage. But he loved the big field there. And later, when he's a teenager, he and Pete Shotton and a lot of people in his bunch that used to hang out together would climb over the wall and climb the trees there and lark about and kick balls and do other things we won't get into at Strawberry Field. But what John is saying in this song is really so very sad. It is the isolation that he felt as a teenager and as an adult, that nobody is like him. If you want to go with him, he'll take you to the place where he belongs, but nobody really wants to go because no one, he says, I think, is in my tree. You know, no one is like me. No one sits where I sit. No one has my vision. No one sees what I see from my tree. And then he tries to explain it. He says, it must be high or low. Maybe I'm too high or maybe I'm down low. And he said, you know, part of me thinks I'm a genius and part of me thinks that I'm a loser. And so I don't know why no one sees the same thing I do, but I'm alone. I'm at Strawberry Field. I'm isolated like an orphan in this walled-in garden, and nobody joins me. No one even sits on the limb that I sit on, and it's just a very, very sad song.
Yeah, I think we're coming up to a break here soon. One thing that was so disturbing to me was that John Lennon's father, who had nothing to do with him, decided to enter his life after he became successful. That just, you know, it's so obvious. That must have really hurt.
You know, but it really, Fred was not at fault. Fred is one of the most maligned people in the Beatles story. Fred wrote to John regularly after John chose his mother and went away with his mother, went back to Liverpool. Can
you hold that? Because we're coming up to commercial.
Sure.
We'll be right back, and you can pick up where you left off. Welcome back. Don and Ella here with you with Jude Kessler. Go ahead and finish your story, Jude, and then I have a question I want to ask.
Okay. So we were talking about Fred Lennon, John's father, who appears in March of 1964 when the Beatles are recording that scene in La Scala, in the Scala Theater for A Hard Day's Night, where they're doing the stage performance for the crowd. And by the way, I think everybody knows Phil Collins happens to be in the crowd. He's in an acting school and was one of the kids chosen to be in the crowd that day to see that being filmed. But that day at noon, John is taken in a car to North End Music Store's headquarters in London, Brian Epstein's offices in Sutherland House in London, and his father is there. And his father has reappeared because there have been many, many articles about him in the newspaper, and he wants to talk with John and set the record straight. And to tell him the story, the true story, which is that for years after he went away to New Zealand, as he had planned to do with John when John was 4.5, he wrote to John very regularly and tried to keep in touch, would have visited him, would have been part of his life. But John's Aunt Mimi wrote to Fred and said, you are a low-class loser. I shouldn't say loser, but you're a ne'er-do-well. And all you're going to do by sending the boy these letters is confuse him. I don't let him read them anyway. I tear them up and throw them away. And you need to stop writing to him. And if you don't, I will make life miserable for you. Never contact him again. Let him grow up in a stable home. Let him be happy. Leave him alone. And Fred did. And I don't know that he would have contacted John at all had these stories not started to circulate which were not true, about how he abandoned John and didn't love him and didn't want him in the newspapers. And he and John visited for about 20 minutes that day in March of 64, and they got on very well. And they actually liked each other. In fact, in Cynthia Lennon's book, she says John came home that night and says he met his father and said, "Sin, he's just like me." And they really got along. And the evidence you have of that is when John's in a bad mood, he's in a bad mood. And he had an interview immediately following his meeting with his father, and he's laughing and joking. I put the interview in my last book, Should Have Known Better, so that you can see exactly what happens the minute after he meets his father. He's in a great mood. He's very happy. He really liked him. And voluntarily, John starts giving him a little bit of money, not much, but a little bit every month. And then he reappears at John's home in 1965 because he wants to meet his grandson. He stays with them for 3 days and then leaves. But John is never able to reconcile the fact that he feels like his father abandoned him for all those years, even though his father did not want to. He really can't ever get over it. So there'll be times when they're very close and then John pushes him away. And then they're very close and then John pushes him away. And this is repeated throughout the relationship that they have together until his father dies. But very truly, he wanted to have a relationship with John. He never wanted to leave him behind.
Oh, that's interesting. I wanted to, and this is a big question, kind of, so you can take as long as you want to answer it. But John is obviously my favorite Beatle, one of my favorite. I think one of the greatest musical talents the world has ever seen, certainly the 20th century. But what I'm impressed with when I listen to the Beatles now, and I do a lot, I keep going back to the earlier Beatles. That's my favorite. I think that's when they were best, very poppy. And my impression was, not only, you mentioned earlier John being the leader of the Beatles, clearly was the leader of the Beatles, but they were, in my opinion, their music was more John-centric in the beginning. I mean, most of the hits to me seemed like they were John songs. He sang the lead on most of them. But gradually, over a period of time, so, by the time Paul begins to take over, whether it was John doing too many drugs or what was going on, but by the time they came out with their most critically acclaimed albums, Abbey Road and Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, those are all Paul-centric albums. So what happened to John? Did he just lose his prolific ability because Paul became prolific, or but John was so prolific early on? Am I wrong in assuming that they were way more John-centric in the beginning?
Oh, you're absolutely 100% right. So let's go back to the very beginning, because it's John's mother, Julia. When John's 14 and a half, his Uncle George dies of cirrhosis of the liver. And Mimi thought that the best way for John to face this, because she knew how close they were, was to send him away to Scotland to her sister's house. And during that time that he was gone, George died and was buried. And when John comes home, he's gone. He didn't even know he was sick. And this man that was his father has died and is completely gone. And John lost it. He became hysterical. He started laughing. He couldn't stop. He laughed for hours. Finally, desperate, not knowing what to do, his cousin suggested that they call Julia. And she comes over, goes up to John's room, calms him down, and says, "Look, here's the deal. You need an Uncle George. So I'm coming back into your life. Not as your mother. You have a mother, but I will be Uncle George." And she became, without a doubt, his closest friend. They were inseparable. I mean, there were some parts of it that probably wouldn't fly with today, because she encouraged him to skip school and hang out with her. And she introduced him to rock and roll. She played her huge rock and roll collection for him, taught him to play the banjo, which she did all over Liverpool. And she said, "John, I'm going to let you in on a secret. You have music in your bones. I am a huge hit as a singer around town. And your father, when he was a steward on the gigantic transport ships that they were taking soldiers from New York to the battlefront, European war front, he would sing every night after dinner. He would stand in the middle of the huge wardroom and he would sing songs like When They Begin to Begin. And they adored him. He had a beautiful voice, so charismatic. And you've inherited that. So you are destined to be a huge star, probably bigger than Elvis. And John bought into it. He believed every word that she said. She encouraged him to form his very first band, the Quarrymen, and they rehearsed at her house. They would go into her tiny bathroom at 1 Blomfield Road, and the acoustics were so great in there, so they'd sit around and sing their songs, and she would put on crazy hats. She was such a bohemian, out-of-the-box character, and she would get pot lids or pan lids and bang them together, and was really their first drummer. And they were so close to her until she was hit by a drunk driver in July of 1958 and was killed, and he lost her a second time to death. But to honor her and to reach for her and to continue to impress her, which is the thing he wanted to do most in the world. He tells you, his mission statement in the White Album, in the song Julia, half of what I say is meaningless, but I say it just to reach you, Julia. So he begins to do that. He sings, writes, records songs for her, so many of them telling her story. And that is what the Beatles, first the Quarrymen, then the Silver Beatles, and all their many iterations until they become the Beatles. That is John's purpose, to prove to her, even though she's gone, that he's valuable, that he's worthy, that he's smart, that he's capable, and that she should have loved him. She should have had him by her side. She has 2 other children, 2 girls, Julia Baird, who wrote John Lennon, My Brother, later Imagine This, and his sister Jackie. Well, Julia, his mother, keeps the 2 girls, but she doesn't keep him. And so he knows she loves children. It's not children she has a problem with, it's him. And he's out to prove to her that she should have loved him and should have wanted him, that he was valuable as a human being. So all of those early songs, many of them, if you go back and listen, are songs for her. I'll Cry Instead. Yeah, I've got a chip on my shoulder that's bigger than my feet. I can't talk to people that I meet. If I could see you now, I'd try to make you sad somehow, but I can't. So I cry instead. All of those early songs, even the cover songs that he does, like Baby It's You, all about how Mimi and George would talk about how immoral, they whisper about how immoral Julia was living with John Dykins. But it doesn't matter what they say. I'm going to love you any old way, or I'll get you. All of the songs about her. So he becomes the leader of this band he's destined to take to the toppermost of the poppermost. After they go to Hamburg and they come home, Paul goes back to work. His father wants him to become a teacher, wants him to finish school. George gets a job as an electrician's mate. Pete goes back to the various bands that he and Ken Brown belonged to, Merseyside, and the Beatles give up the dream. And John goes around, knocks on their doors and says, what are you doing? We're going to be famous. We're destined to be famous. You're not getting a daytime job. We've got to work. We're going to work at the Cavern Club at lunchtime. We're going to get gigs. You can't have a job, quit. And he brings his band back together. And through the years, many times, George wants to quit many, many times. He never thinks they're going to be famous, and he doesn't really enjoy, he never loved the touring. I mean, who would love things being thrown at you and living in a box and you're locked into a hotel? And many times George wants to quit, but John always brings his band back together. So yes, he and Paul open Please Please Me singing as a duet. In the next album with the Beatles, it's John's voice solo without even instruments behind him that opens with the Beatles with It Won't Be Long. He opens and dominates A Hard Day's Night. In fact, it's almost a solo LP. Paul has a song, but mainly it's a John Lennon LP. Beatles for Sale, again, John dominated. Even when they do Help, which of course is John's song, it is a John-dominated LP. But you move into the end of 1965 with Rubber Soul, and suddenly Paul opens the album. It's Paul's song that opens the album. And Paul is emerging as a force. Now, from the very day that John met Paul at the Woolton Garden Fete, when they go across the street to the church hall and Paul comes over and quote unquote auditions for John by singing 20 Flight Rock, John knows this boy is a force to be reckoned with. He's smart. He can tune his own guitar. He writes songs. And he can do something John can't do. He can remember lyrics. John can never remember lyrics, never. And so this boy is good looking, he's charismatic, and he is a big dog. He is a leader. So John does not ask Paul McCartney to join his band, even though everyone wanted McCartney in there. He says, no. Let me think about this. So he goes home, lies on his bed in that room above the glassed-in porch in Mendip's, Aunt Mimi's house, and he thinks about it. And finally, after 3 days, he decides that for the good of the band, because he knows McCartney can get him to where he wants to go, to the toppermost of the toppermost, for the good of the band, he's going to send a henchman to invite Paul to join his group. But he's going to have to keep an eye on this kid because he's very dominant, and he knows that from the minute he admits him to the group, he's going to struggle to get to the top. And he does. I mean, it's not John that wants George Harrison in the group. It's Paul. And Paul makes him audition George. And when John won't admit him to the group because George is only 14 and John is 17, and he's embarrassed to have a child in his group, Paul brings him to the morgue skiffle cellar in March of 1958 anyway. And John says, what's he doing here? And Paul says he's joining the group. So immediately Paul is asserting his authority. But by the end of 1965, John, of course, has taken LSD, as we said a minute ago, in March of 1965, and he is in the throes of LSD. He and Cynthia are fighting all the time, and their marriage is beginning to fall apart. And he is distracted. The last time that John was this distracted was in August of 1962, when he found out that Cynthia was pregnant. And they had to rush and get married very quickly. And during that interval, Paul made sure that Pete Best was released from the band. John and Pete were close friends, and George and Paul had tried to convince John to get rid of Pete Best for months and months and months, and he wouldn't have anything to do with it. But when John's distracted by this marriage, they finally convince him to just get rid of Pete Best and to bring Ringo Starr into the group, which of course was, a great thing for the Beatles. But Pete was very accomplished as well. There was nothing wrong with Pete. What was wrong with Pete was that Pete was good looking and popular with the girls, and that many times the girls would take the pictures of the Beatles and rip the other Beatles' faces off the photo and pin the picture of Pete to their jumpers or their sweaters. So they wanted Pete out, and it happened during that interval in 62 when John is distracted. Well, now at the end of 65, again, he is involved in drugs. He is involved in the dissolution of his marriage. And so that is when Paul steps up and he becomes stronger. And from that point in the end of 65 up to the White Album, he is going to dominate the group. He's going to make the decisions. And John really abdicates because he's got bigger things on his plate to worry about than the band, which is unbelievable for John Lennon. That's how sick he is and how sad he is and how depressed he is. He even says it in Your Blues, and people brush off Your Blues as just a parody of a blues song. But John said when he wrote it, he was so depressed that he thought about committing suicide. And I'm lonely, want to die. I'm lonely, want to die. If I ain't dead already, girl, you know the reason why. He becomes involved with Yoko. She begins to pull him out of his depression, and he begins to emerge as strong again. And on the White Album, he has enough songs on the White Album for a double Lennon album, just John, and he emerges again. But from late 65 up to the making of the White Album, it's Paul's band. So Sgt. Pepper, Magical Mystery Tour, all the things that happened in those years are under Paul's leadership, not John. So you're absolutely right on target.
Well, thanks.
Jude, I have a quick question, and I don't mean to put you on the spot. By the way, your name is perfect for our discussion, and
Yeah.
we can touch on that. Would you mind, I can tell we're going to run out of time. Would you mind coming back next Monday? I don't know if hopefully it's not New Year's Eve, but there's just so much to discuss about the Beatles.
I know, there is.
Yeah, I have dozens of questions. Is that a possibility?
Sure, I would love to, absolutely love to. What topic could be better than this? So yes, thank you very much.
Okay, so your name Jude, was that influenced by, I don't know your age, was that influenced by the Beatles in any capacity?
No, I was Judith, which I always hated. I changed my name so many times. At one point, I changed my name to Annabelle. And then on my Social Security card, I had it as Judy with an I. And my parents, of course, flipped out when I told them that, because they're like, you can't have the wrong name on your Social Security card. You're going to get in trouble. And I had to go down and change it. I mean, I never liked my name. And when I was getting ready to publish the first book, there was another Jude Kessler, who was an author, had written many books, and my husband had always called me Jude from day one. And he said, so why don't you just go by what I've always called you? And so at that point, which has been, I don't know, 13, 14 years ago, I really got rid of the name. I had never liked Jude as an Irish name, and I have Irish heritage. So it was just a perfect fit, even though it's a Paul song and not a John song.
Yeah, I was going to say. Yeah, so there wasn't because it is pretty amazing that, like I said, I had to use that thing, "Hey Jude," whatever, because I mean, it's a natural. You must get that all the time.
Oh yeah,
Hey,
oh
Jude.
yeah, and I love it. And listen, I think Paul McCartney is a musical genius. I mean, he is still very relevant today. And look at him, still going. If it hadn't been for COVID, he would still be performing. I went to see him in Bossier City, Louisiana, about 2 years ago, and he performed for almost 3 hours, jumping, running, going from place to place. And people said, I never saw him take one sip of water. And my husband said, I think I saw him take a sip of water at one point when the lights were down. But other than that, can you imagine being that fit and that relevant? He never gets old.
Mm-hmm. And you know what I read, that in the beginning, at least, that they weren't considered necessarily great musicians. And I thought that was so interesting. But we all know it's not just the ability to play an instrument, it's what they create out of those instruments.
Right. And people really overlook their ability as musicians. I would say that Paul McCartney is one of the greatest bass players in the entire world. He plays the bass like a lead guitar, and he is magnificent at what he does. Ringo is underestimated as a drummer, but Buddy Rich once said he considered Ringo to be one of the top 10 drummers in the world. And just while we're on that subject, there's a myth that John Lennon said Ringo isn't the best drummer in Liverpool. He isn't even the best drummer in the Beatles. And that was not a John Lennon statement. That was a joke said by a comedian 3 years after John passed away. And Mark Lewison has dispelled that myth. Those words never came out of John's mouth, but that's something we can talk about next week, because he's credited with saying so many things that he didn't say. But George Harrison is such a gifted lead guitarist, and not at all vain, because when he wants lead lines played to perfection, what does he do? Brings in Eric Clapton. But he's a very gifted lead guitarist. And John is never recognized for his ability to play rhythm guitar. But there are many songs, and we can go into this next week, where he created unique rhythm tracks and was so proud of them and was never given credit for it. So they truly weren't. When they started, they were terrible. When they used to practice in the Jacaranda, in the basement of the Jacaranda, Alan Williams would have complaints from people upstairs saying, what is going on down there? It sounds like cats dying. They were terrible, terrible. but they worked and worked and worked and honed their craft and became excellent musicians. And today it's hard to replicate their music because they are so gifted and so multi-level and multi-dimensional.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
I think that's part of success. Go ahead.
Quincy Jones, I'm sure you probably heard his comments last year. That was awful. What was going on there? Was that just jealousy? Where he said some awful things about the Beatles were crap musicians. I think he called Paul one of the worst bass players he'd ever heard. Did you read those comments?
Yes, and REM one time in the 90s called them elevator music, but I truly, they are played in elevators because they're still popular. And what has happened to you, REM? Where are you?
Exactly. Hey, Quincy Jones, come on. I'm sorry, I interrupted you. What did you have to say?
Oh, no, that's okay. Since we just have a few minutes, I would love to hear you have a podcast and maybe talk some more about your books so we can share them because it's Christmas time, guys. What a better gift.
Yes.
Everybody loves the Beatles. I don't think there's anybody in the world, maybe some secluded parts in different countries, maybe in China, where they're not allowed to, they don't have the freedom to maybe listen to the music they would like. Yeah, so I'd love to hear about those, hear about your podcast and hear about your books. And I want to encourage everybody to purchase your books.
Thank you so much. They are available. The first three books. The first one is Should Have Been There, and volume 1 covers John's birth to December of 1961 when Brian Epstein offers them that loose managerial agreement, and it changes them. Those are the Liverpool years. Everybody's in the band at that point except for Ringo, and he comes in book number 2. They know him, they're friends with him, but they haven't made that switch from Pete to Ringo yet. Book number 2, Shivering Inside, is 61 to 63. Ringo comes in, John and Cynthia get married, they do Love Me Do, and then that day that we talked about, that day in which they record Please Please Me, and I take you minute by minute through that day using the records from EMI, exactly what they say in the book they actually said in real life, and you go minute through minute in the making of Please Please Me. And then the third book, She Loves You, is 63 to the beginning of 64. It ends when they've done Ed Sullivan and Washington, D.C. concert at Carnegie Hall, and they're headed back to England to make A Hard Day's Night. And then 1964 comes in volume 4, Should Have Known Better, and you get that magical year of 64, the height of Beatlemania, in which everything that you think about the Beatles doing from A Hard Day's Night on is in that book, and I'm working right now on 65. But people are going to read this. It reads just like it's a novel, and you'll notice every sentence is footnoted, and you go to the back of the book, there's lots of extra information at the back about what they were doing, and then at the end of every chapter there are questions. What couldn't I include in this chapter? And we go through all kinds of information that doesn't work into the narrative but happened during that episode, and then I list all the sources. There are about 30 or 40 sources for each chapter, so it makes you feel as if you're there, you're with them, you're present when they're recording their songs, when they're on stage, when they're touring, but you're getting the actual story. So it's called a historical narrative, not historical fiction. It's a historical narrative. And they're at johnlennonseries.com. That comes to me, as do my Amazon orders, and I can sign the book for you and date it, but I would not, if you're going to order the book, I would really suggest that you not have it personalized, because I only do 1,000 copies of every book, and volumes 1, 2, and 3 are sold out, and 4, I only have about 40 copies left, and they are selling, 1, 2, and 3 are selling between $400 and $1,000 a copy. So your book will be much more valuable if I just sign and date it. And I can happy to enclose a note on a separate sheet of paper, but who knows? Someday someone might want to sell the book. The podcast is She Said, She Said, and it is on Podbean and Spotify, YouTube.